If you enjoy our work, consider making a donation to mixtapestories.net or at Patreon/Mixtape Stories, all one word. Thank you. Mixtape Stories, creating beautiful fiction in a disappointing timeline.
Hey travelers, while this retrospective won't have a full synopsis beginning to end, it will contain some minor spoilers. I want you to imagine it. It's June 1942. Your parents think that big band music is nothing but a bunch of noise. You do admit that it sounds a little coarse, but you copped your first feel to that song. Speaking of, you just said your goodbyes to your best girl Mildred, or Esther, or was it Gladys? You're a seaman first class on the USS Enterprise, the flagship of the Pacific Fleet, steaming towards Midway to face off against the very same Japs who launched that devastating sneak attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. You've never seen combat before, neither have most of your buddies, or even most of the commanders, with the exception of some of the old salts that had been around during the Great War. You're nervous, just like the other boys, but you don't dare write that in your letter to your parents. That might get to them in about 6 months. Now I want you to imagine you're a Seahawk pilot prepping to deploy the first squads of Navy SEALs who will soften the target for the larger force to liberate Indonesia from the Islamic terrorists who call themselves the Caliphate. You've been at war your entire career since graduating from the Naval Academy, back when you were just some young chica among a bunch of dudes. More women had joined your ranks in the decades since 9/11. Nearly 20 years of unceasing hostilities have obliterated the prohibitions against anyone willing to serve, regardless of gender identification or sexual orientation. And racial identity is your grandparents' problem. You can no longer count the number of sorties where you delivered Marines or other naval personnel into one sandbox or another. You can't remember if it was Baghdad, Damascus, or Aden, but somewhere along the way, this song became your ship's anthem. Even though it's an oldie, the kids love it. And now, I want you to imagine that the worlds of these two military personnel from different time periods are about to collide. It's 2004.
Has ties to terrorist groups and seeks or possesses weapons of mass destruction is a grave danger to the civilized world and will be confronted.
We have basic bitch cell phones, email, and slow internet wired to desktops. Arrested Development is the only show standing up to reality TV.
Arrested Development.
Hey, that's the name of the show.
But most importantly, we're on the other side of 9/11, where everything is seen through the post-9/11 lens, to include military sci-fi. Speaking of, an Australian named John Birmingham, who's world famous in Australia, just published the first novel entitled Weapons of Choice in the trilogy called Axis of Time. I was in Books A Million because they still existed back then, and I read the book jacket to Weapons of Choice and was immediately intrigued by the plot. So the novel starts 17 years in the future on January 15, 2021 to be exact. Remember 2021?
This year's COVID-19 death toll in the U.S. is higher than last year's. New data from the CDC shows a total.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
Breach of the Capitol! Breach of the Capitol!
Yeah. Good times. Okay, now, forget everything you remember about 2021. In Weapons of Choice, on January 15, 2021, there is no pandemic. The U.S. isn't suffering from early onset dementia, nor is it on the precipice of having its democracy overthrown, which will come to fruition in a few years later. America's actually intact in this version of 2021, though the U.S. and the rest of the world have been fighting the global war on terror, GWOT, for 20 years now. America and the Allied nations have been waging an endless war against the freedom haters as Islamic extremism spread. By 2021, the U.S. and its allies had now invaded Syria, Yemen, and other places Lonely Planet repeatedly warned backpackers to reconsider visiting. And this brings us to our 21st century cast. A multinational fleet in the Waitar Straits off the coast of East Timor is about to launch an attack to liberate Indonesia from the so-called Caliphate, which overthrew the government a few years earlier. Led by the Americans, the multinational fleet is comprised of various destroyers, carriers, and subs from countries to include Great Britain, Australia, France, a few free Indonesian vessels, and even a Japanese self-defense force ship. Oh, and there's a research vessel called the Nagoya, which had no intention of being in hostile waters, but when the multinational fleet was assembled, one of the Australian ships assigned to guard her against any pirates was called up to join the fleet. The Nagoya couldn't be out in open waters unescorted with all of its expensive equipment, much to the chagrin of Professor Manning Pope, who wanted to run his experiment already. So they had to tag along with this multinational fleet. Professor Pope is sending heated emails to the fleet commander, Admiral Philip Colehammer, who's aboard the flagship, the supercarrier USS Hillary Clinton. Yeah, this was written in the early 2000s. Admiral Colehammer's got enough on his plate. They're hours away from launching their operation. The Malaysian government has been vacillating back and forth on their blessing, being near their waters. And what's more, the Chinese keep threatening to come in and blow the caliphate to hell, given how the jihadis had been torturing and murdering ethnic Chinese en masse. And if that's not enough, Colehammer's in the middle of an interview with Julia Duffy, a New York Times reporter who's been an embed journalist her entire adult life. Well, Professor Pope can't wait any longer, and he fires up his experiment. Something to do with quantum foam theory? Don't worry about the details, just go with it. And holy shit, Pope's experiment creates a wormhole, which immediately spaghettifies the research vessel, and suddenly the multinational fleet disappears. Scene change. It's evening, June 2nd, 1942, some 200 nautical miles north-northeast of Midway Island. The USS Enterprise is heading Task Force 16 to intercept Japanese Admiral Yamamoto and his fleet. Naval intelligence decrypted the Japanese codes, and they know that the ships are heading towards the Aleutian Islands in Alaska are a feint, and the real goal is to deny Americans Midway Island. Admiral Spruance is hoping to catch the Japs before they hit Midway. Spruance is conferring with Lieutenant Commander Daniel Black. They're going over some logistics when suddenly there's an ear-splitting crack followed by a wave of warm air, and suddenly alarms go off. So this is when the two fleets collide, like literally. A bunch of ships from the multinational fleet from 2021 suddenly emerges in the middle of the Pacific, like right where the American fleet, headed by Spruance, is heading for Midway. In fact, one of the 21st century ships, the USS Leyte Gulf, emerges into 1942, partially where the USS Astoria is. Admiral Spruance's fleet sees a bunch of strange vessels, and The first vessel they see is clearly the Japanese ship mentioned earlier, the Suranui. Spruance orders his ships to fire with everything they got against what appears to be a fleet of Japanese ships who got the jump on them somehow. Meanwhile, everyone in the multinational fleet are all passed out, having gone through a wormhole. Taking fire from unknown vessels, the automated combat intelligence takes over and delivers a devastating firing solution on Spruance's fleet. For several minutes, it's an all-out battle between the two fleets, as the 21st century personnel slowly awaken, covered in their own sick, to find themselves under attack. But members of the 21st century crew recognize the old vessels firing on them, and Admiral Colehammer puts it together and reaches out to the Enterprise. It takes some convincing, but the firing ceases. The result was that much of Spruance's fleet heading for Midway is scrapped. Same for some of the multinational fleet. And let's remember, the damage to the multinational fleet's ships and equipment is not replaceable. The research vessel which sent them to 1942 was completely destroyed. So this is it. They're stuck in 1942. But even if they could return, their emergence drastically changed history, as the U.S. fleet heading for Midway has to return to Pearl Harbor, having been decimated. This alone would be bad enough, but it gets worse. You see, not all of the vessels from 2021 arrived in the vicinity of the deadly encounter near Midway. One ship emerges in the Antarctic and sinks. Another ship emerges atop a mountain in Japanese-occupied New Guinea, sticking halfway out of the mountain. And one ship, an Indonesian vessel, the Sutanto, emerges near the Aleutian Islands, where it is captured by the Japanese. This changes everything. Both the Allies and the Imperial Japanese, who read in the Nazis, learn what happened in the original history. I mean, everything. The Sutanto's crew, under Japanese control, try their best to deal with their situation. Indonesian sailor Lieutenant Moritopo pretends he's eager to turn on his former allies in the Americans, but slow walks teaching the Japanese the technology of his ship. Not that the Sutanto is anything compared to the US, British, and Australian naval vessels. The Sutanto was formerly an East German ship built in the 1980s that had to be retrofitted. But its real value is all of the books, and more importantly, the flexipads containing all of the historical information. Flexipads being the analog to today's tablets and smartphones. I want you to think about that. Every secret operation that occurred during the war, every double agent on both sides of the conflict, and every German and Soviet general who smack-talked Hitler or Stalin, everything you get by watching the military channel suddenly became fully known to the powers that be on all sides of the conflict. The Nazis and the Imperial Japanese learn of their fate, and they learn this before their fortunes turn for the worse. Knowing what happened the first time around will drastically change the Axis' strategy as it's laid out in Book 2, Designated Targets, and Book 3, Final Impact. But what makes the Axis of Time trilogy so engrossing has little to do with the altered history of where the Axis comes up with new plans or the cast of historical figures that Birmingham uses to bring the story to life to include both Allied and Axis big shots. There's plenty of time travel and alternate historical fiction out there. But Birmingham does something different here, something akin to Back to the Future. He focuses on the cultural rifts between the Americans of the 2020s versus their counterparts in the 1940s. We're introduced to this during the unfortunate initial counter between the multinational fleet and Spruance's fleet, specifically on the Leyte Gulf from 2021, which emerged into 1942, partially fused into the USS Astoria from the Midway fleet. The two ships' crews each think the other has attacked and boarded them. Of course, when a sailor from 1942 enters a section of the Leyte Gulf and sees an array of LED screens and strange fiber optic cables, he's stunned. When he's shot at by a soldier wearing what looks to be a Nazi helmet and bizarre goggles, and he's firing an automatic weapon, it's even more disorienting. But what a sailor from 1942 cannot accept is that when there's a lull in the fighting, and the captain from the enemy ships claims to be an American, the captain is a black woman. Once the two fleets stop fighting and limp back to Pearl Harbor together, we get introduced to a wide cast from both 1942 contemporaries, or temps as they're called, and the 21st century crew, who bring with them something far more dangerous than technology and knowledge of historical events and the secret lives of historical figures. The uptimers, as they come to be called, bring with them the sensibilities of the post-millennium multiculturalism. This multi-ethnic, gender-blind society, let's call it what it is, diversity, equity, and inclusion, complete with their rock and roll, hip-hop, and Benetton cast, is as frightening to many in the Allied West in 1942 as the prospect of the Axis winning. And this leads to some nasty stuff. Early in the first book, Weapons of Choice, Captain Daytona Anderson, the aforementioned black female captain of the Leyte Gulf, and a Japanese lieutenant of the multinational fleet are found dead on the beach, having been brutally murdered, which Julia Duffy, the embed New York Times journalist, discovers despite being sequestered on the USS Hillary Clinton, the flagship. Julia becomes a major character in the story, and for good reason. She's not military, she's a journalist with the New York Times embedded with the 82nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. Julia has seen more shit in her time in one sandbox or another than many of the Marines from the 82nd MEU, and definitely more than any temp. You have to remember that most U.S. soldiers, Marines, and sailors hadn't seen any action yet in 1942. So the embed journalists in this version of 2021 kind of become more like active participants in the fighting, as jihadis don't distinguish between enemy fighters and journalists. 20 years of endless war against Islamic extremists created a variety of unusual adjustments, one of which being a combat journalist becoming combatants themselves. In our time, Richard Engel doesn't carry an MP5 and shoot up ISIS, but we imagine in this fictional 2021, the NBC correspondent would have been kitted out with the latest gen night vision goggles and packing a submachine gun. But Julia's confirmed kills is not the thing that makes the locals clutch their pearls. She befriends and eventually beds a local named Lieutenant Dan Black, who is on the Enterprise at Midway. She hooks up with Black early on, an aspect of 21st century liberation that Dan does not mind. But she represents her generation, which I would say is mid to late millennial. I'm guessing she was born in the early 1990s. Julia's brash, she swears like a sailor, and blabs about her sexual exploits freely in polite company to her friend Rosanna Natoli, a colleague with CNN, who likewise was on the Clinton during the transition, as it comes to be called. There's a scene where Julia and Rosanna are at a hotel in Pearl Harbor, and he brought along with him a boombox and are playing the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil in the earshot of the locals, to include Lieutenant Commander Dan Black, who is shocked by the strange rhythmic sounds emanating from this most bizarre device. He's not the only one to hear future music. Back on the Leyte Gulf, which as you remember was fused to the USS Astoria, the two ships were sinking. Spruance and Kohlhammer agree that they need to grab everything they can from the Leyte Gulf before it sinks, as it contains irreplaceable 21st century technology. All of those laptops or slates, all of the flexipads or tablets, all of the weapons, the computer monitors, hell, even the IKEA chairs and the Lavazza espresso machines. The haul of the 21st century equipment is massive, so they get crews from the Astoria to help clear the Leyte Gulf before it sinks. One volunteer, Slim Jim Davidson, a bottom-rung seaman who chose the Navy over being sent to prison for check fraud, sees an opportunity. He volunteers for the job and pockets a flexipad, some data sticks, and anything else that may look like it could be sold in the black market. It sounds like the things he swiped were personal mobile devices, not government-owned equipment. A lot of people died on both the Leyte Gulf as well as on the Astoria during the unfortunate fusion and subsequent skirmish. So maybe the rightful owners weren't around to claim it when Slim Jim got his grubby hands on it. It doesn't take long for him to figure out how to work the touchscreen FlexiPad. So think about your smartphone or your tablet if you downloaded all of your entertainment. In this fictional 2021, that's what everyone does. They didn't stream, they downloaded entertainment on a data sticks and directly into their FlexiPads. Maybe it's because they were beyond cell range. I don't know. So imagine Slim Jim's got his hold of your tablet with all of your videos that you watch. Yeah, even the videos you specifically view on private mode. And he listens to a hip-hop song, the title of which is so horrible that I shan't repeat it. And the lyrics are so vulgar that they even shock Slim Jim. With all of this in hand, he knows he's got something far better than gold. It's not the FlexiPad itself, it's the treasure trove of entertainment contained within it. Hundreds of movies, TV shows, and thousands of songs spanning decades. Slim Jim's gonna do something with that. Some minor shit happens in the first novel of Weapons of Choice, and I won't spoil it, but we do learn that the Imperial Japanese have the Indonesian vessels, and by the end of the Weapons of Choice novel, the Nazis managed to get a ceasefire with the Soviets. Weapons of Choice has a passing resemblance to the 1980 movie Final Countdown. Not the song, the movie. The one with Martin Sheen and Kirk Douglas. You probably haven't heard of it. Well, in that movie, the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz from the present, well, if you want to call 1980 the present, is sent back to the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor through a mysterious storm. They aren't detected by either the contemporary Americans or the Japanese who are steaming towards Hawaii. When they realize when they are, the crew from the Nimitz gets all excited. They could easily wipe out Yamamoto's fleet of Zeros with their fleet of F-14s. In fact, there's a scene where an F-14 effortlessly takes out a Zero who is on a reconnaissance mission. The characters argue the implications of destroying Yamamoto's fleet, how it could change history in ways that they couldn't predict, the whole butterfly effect. I mean, what if stopping the Japanese ends up somehow keeping America out of the war, leading to the Nazis staying in power in Europe, and Arnold Schwarzenegger is never born to save John Connor? The crew say, meh, screw it. Let's scrap the Japs, Hitler, and the Soviets while we're at it. Oh, and let's put in a reminder to invest in Apple computers in 35 years. But before they can get their plan in order, they're sent back to good old 1980 without any rhyme or reason. Final Countdown turned out to be a huge disappointment, not only because we didn't get to see a lopsided victory, but the director didn't even touch the social changes that took place over the past 39 years. And you'd think that being on an aircraft carrier, you'd get at least one good Kenny Loggins song. Weapons of Choice also reminds me of the 1984 movie Philadelphia Experiment, starring, I don't know, some actors you've seen around. A ship in 1943, I guess located in Philadelphia, is testing a radar cloaking technology and are thrown out of time. Two sailors from the ship are thrown out of the ship and they land in some desert. On their walkabout, they pick up a beer bottle, Lowenbrau. Oh shit, it's German. And it's a shitty German beer. But it gets even worse. They're in Nevada. That, and they're in the future, 1984 to be exact. So it turns out some goobers at a nearby military base just tested the same technology that was tested back in 1943, and somehow the entire military base is also thrown out of time. Anyway, between the video game machines, color TV, and the presence of a transvestite, I believe that's the proper term in the 1980s, the two sailors are really out of place. I like what they're trying to do here. But we're not here to discuss Final Countdown or the Philadelphia Experiment. We're here to discuss the Axis of Time trilogy. Sorry about that. In Book 2, designated Targets, 4 months have passed since the transition. It's October 1942, and outside of Los Angeles, the Americans set up the Special Administrative Zone, where Admiral Colehammer, who led the multinational fleet intended for Indonesia, runs the show. In the zone, also called 51 for Area 51, they live under the military codes as they were on January 15, 2021. This means all incoming recruits who want to join the auxiliary forces are treated according to the customs and laws of 2021. There is no segregation. Marriage equality is the law of the land. Women have the same rights as men. Remember, this is a fictional 2021. And anyone joining the AF, as it's also called, who has issues taking orders from a woman, a black, Hispanic, or Asian officer can kindly go fuck off. Also, there's no smoking indoors and you have to wear seatbelts. So this is where Birmingham sets his series apart from your standard time travel stories. He imagines all of the details of the cultural clash between 2021 and 1942. There's the things you would expect. White dudes are more openly racist and sexist than they are today. Though I bet there's an asterisk to be had on that. And yeah, I know racism is alive and well in our 2025. I mean, look how many black generals and admirals are fired this year. But first, you have to remember that this is a fictional 2021. And second, there's something most people don't appreciate about our U.S. military. Despite it being known as a conservative organization, actually the U.S. military has historically been among the most progressive forces. It started with Truman's Executive Order in 1948 that desegregated the military years before Brown versus the Board of Education. In the Axis of Time series, you have an American military from 2021 stuck in 1942 where Marine Colonel Lonesome Jones, who is black, has to deal with some of the local crackers. You have a British captain, Karen Halabi, who is both a woman and part South Asian, dealing with old British lords. The Greatest Generation, with its worldview, is confronted with the 21st century's Gen X, Millennial, and Zoomers and their sensibilities. You can insert jokes about participation trophies, but these aren't your standard slackers and the spawn of helicopter parenting. These are sailors, soldiers, and Marines who volunteered to fight in the global war on terror 20 years on. Granted, a lot of the generational gap has to do with racial attitudes, but it also has to do with young servicemen horrified by the brutal tactics employed by these warriors from the future, who faced an enemy that live-streamed beheadings of captured enemies. You have to remember that the locals haven't seen what the Japanese and Nazis do with their prisoners yet, and they haven't done Dresden, Hiroshima, or Vietnam yet either. Along with the coarsened war culture of the uptimers, the locals are also introduced to the styles, music, and movies from the future, much of which is being pumped out by our old friend Slim Jim, who lucked out in getting an attorney and started a business. A lot of it's kind of difficult to swallow, A lowly seaman managing to hire this lady's services, and they somehow are able to license the entertainment, and he's no longer in active service? But go with it, because what Birmingham presents is mind-blowing. In 1942, you have Glenn Miller getting into disco. You have people playing Metallica. You have a local mafia watching The Sopranos. In the auxiliary forces, they do a cadence to Faith No More's We Care a Lot. And someone's adapting Smells Like Teen Spirit into a swing number. Okay, that one was mine. But architects, clothing designers, musicians, they all absorb the culture of the next 80 years, as half the country wants to become the future, while the other half wants to send them back, if they could. Birmingham brings about as realistic a scenario of how people from the 1940s would react to the 2020s. Naturally, old folks born in the 1800s would not likely get into dubstep. But you can imagine a young couple in 1942 could enjoy dancing to Night Fever by the Bee Gees or Into the Groove by Madonna. You could also imagine they'd appreciate the post-sexual revolution sensibilities of the uptimers. Beyond the cultural rift and eventual integration of the two time periods, Birmingham likewise explores how the warring nations would seek to adapt their existing technology to all of the wonders of the future. You'd think it'd be easy. Hey, let's reverse engineer those fancy F-22s so we can scrap the Japs. Well, you'd be extraordinarily wrong. The skin of the F-22 alone is made of a composite material that's classified that does not have the industrial base to create it. Even your most basic microchip would require a decade of Project Manhattan-like effort to build the technological infrastructure. Both sides face the fact that whatever was brought over from 2021 is non-replenishable. This is important when the Nazis make an attempt to invade England, and the 21st century British vessel, the Trident, has only so many metal storm rounds. And the USS Hillary Clinton, docked in Hawaii, had most of its catapults destroyed and can no longer launch the F-22s, as it's being retrofitted by standard hydraulic catapults. There is no way any country can produce 21st century tech in 1942. However, they can use their existing industrial base to produce napalm, variants of the AK-47, and Chinook helicopters. They can likewise adjust their design methods to manufacture the Mustangs and Shermans with all of the end-of-line production upgrades. But I know you're wondering about the nukes. Well, I said I won't spoil things, but I will say that some shit does get dropped. Back when the Axis of Time series came out, which was between 2004 and 2007, America was embroiled in the global war on terror. The heady moments in 2003 of Mission Accomplished were replaced by the realities of a quagmire in Iraq, while Afghanistan remained somewhat in the back burner. Most readers, including myself, could see America repeatedly finding itself in more brushfire wars, especially when the options looked like it was going to be between Warhawk John McCain against Warhawk Hillary Clinton. And in this scenario, with an America putting boots into Syria, Libya, Yemen, and other sandboxes not mentioned, it would make sense that the military would make rapid advancements in biotech, as well as other material science upgrades. Of course, history did not unfold the way Birmingham envisioned for the story. Hillary got her nomination derailed by a handsome young upstart who no one believed had a chance, not only because he was black, but because he was a first-term senator with no real machine behind him. Obama won in part because, as he said, he just didn't believe in stupid wars, something even many emerging MAGAs agreed with. Other events still happened. There wasn't a caliphate in Indonesia, but ISIS ran roughshod throughout Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Assad's regime nearly crashed, and it would have early on were it not for Putin. But the jihadis never got their hands on nukes to incinerate a major city or launch a bioweapon as we feared. The US still had to contend with much of the unraveling in the Middle East during the 2010s, but Obama decided that a lighter footprint was a way to deal with ISIS. Rather than invade Libya, Syria, and re-invading Iraq, something akin to what America did in the Axis of Time trilogy, Obama chose to utilize special forces to provide air support and training to allies who wouldn't cut and run. I'm looking at you, Iraqi and Afghan forces. Leveraging local allies and keeping a low profile wasn't sexy, but it minimized American casualties. It was cheaper, and it worked. The strategy was so successful that Trump, despite the fact that he would never admit it, largely continued with that policy. Trump actually went one further in the disengagement from forever wars and cut a deal with the Taliban in February 2020 to bug out of Afghanistan entirely over the next year without any input from the Afghan government, who were beyond inept and catastrophically corrupt. Biden didn't fuss about inheriting that agreement with the Taliban, and neither did the majority of the American people, right up until Kabul fell to the Taliban again. In other words, America was out of the nation-building business. By the time January 15, 2021 rolled around, the date of the multinational fleet's disappearance, the situation in our America, in our 2021, was something that neither Birmingham nor anyone else could have envisioned in the early 2000s. Instead of preparing to liberate some far-off archipelago from the freedom haters, America was reeling from the violent attack on the Capitol a little over a week earlier, not by jihadi terrorists, but by white nationalists unleashed by the sitting president. Democracy was on the edge of collapse. Again, not by Islamic terrorists, but by the rot within our own people. Had Birmingham wrote about that America in 2004, not only would he not have been able to construct a multinational fleet scenario, nobody would believe him. To be clear, John Birmingham wasn't trying to predict the future in weapons of choice. Whenever I write stories set in the future, I do not have any conceit that I can predict what will actually happen. Rather, I'm telling a story about what's going on today through the setting of a future to allow room for creative diversion from our current reality. In that same light, Birmingham was taking the zeitgeist of the early 2000s and using that to tell a story of comparing who we are in the 21st century to who we were back in the 1940s. And despite the historical changes between the fictional 2021 and the actual 2021, Birmingham hit the cultural sensibilities on the head. Birmingham's Axis of Time trilogy truly does what so many other films and books failed to do. He explored the essential elements of what makes time travel, particularly between the decades in the 20th and 21st centuries, so fascinating. Because it's not just about the technology itself, or knowledge of historical events. It's who we are as a nation, a people, our sensibilities and values, in contrast to our grandparents and our great-grandparents. I hope you enjoyed our retrospective of John Birmingham's Axis of Time trilogy. Next month I will return with an audio drama about a gray alien who came to Earth on a sort of Peace Corps mission to help the local primate humans, where he discovers an incredible elixir called coffee. And I want to send out a thanks to a donor, Andrea L.,